Yo, so over the past few years, I've been trying to get more and more into some of the classic 80s movies, and it's fair to say the 1980s did have a lot of great stuff. I mean, I'm not saying that the 2000s and the 2010s we didn't have our fair share of big summer blockbusters, but if you ask many people what one of the best decades is for film, I imagine quite a lot of people would say the 1980s. I mean, that's ultimately where a lot of directors ended up with some fairly big stuff, such as Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, and John Hughes. And over the years, I have started to go through a couple more of the 80s movies that I somehow put off for a long time, including Ghostbusters, Die Hard, The Princess Bride, Dead Poets Society, The Breakfast Club, Goonies, and as I did most recently, Robocop. But I managed to recently add another 80s classic to my collection, the 1984 sports classic, The Karate Kid. Now, here's the thing. I distinctly remember 2010 when the Karate Kid remake with Jaden Smith and Jackie Chan was coming out. And it's weird to me to think that that movie now is over 10 years old. How time flies. But here's the thing: when that film was coming out, I actually had no idea that it was actually based on an existing film. Like I saw the trailers for it. I didn't actually go to see it at the cinema, but I saw the trailers for it. I saw bits and pieces. I thought, yeah, it looked like a good film. But then, as I heard so many people talking about the Karate Kid, and honestly, what turned me onto the fact that there was an original was the fact that it shows up as a plot point in How I Met Your Mother. To which Barney's saying it was his favourite movie when he was a kid and he idolised the villain. I'm just thinking to myself, I gotta say, you're saying William Zabka. I'm looking this guy up, and he looks nothing like the evil kid in the Karate Kid. But eventually, I was turned on to the fact that there was an original Karate Kid from 1984. So, but I finally got the DVD and I sat down and watched it through. And before I start, here's a quick summary of the Karate Kid franchise. You got the original Karate Kid, the one I've just shown you, which is from 1984. You've got a sequel to it, The Karate Kid Part 2, which is from 1986. They did another sequel in 1989, which, from what I've heard, Part 2 isn't necessarily as good as Part 1, but it's still a decent follow up. Part 3 is where things really start to go downhill. Then they had the next Karate Kid, which was a spin off released in 1994 starring Hilary Swank. And they also had a cartoon in 1989, and of course, in 2018, YouTube Red, and then later Netflix, released a series called Cobra Kai, which is kind of like a follow up. And of course, you got the Karate Kid in 2010. So it's had a franchise that seemingly has lasted from the 1980s here to now, and the it's fairly it's fairly weird of how far it's come. I mean, the series is now almost 40 years old, and yet they're still going strong with it. So, before we go into anything, here's a quick rundown of the plot. Daniel LaRusso, played by Ralph Macchio, he and his mother, after she gets a job in California, they move from their home in New Jersey to their new home in, of course, Los Angeles. And Los Angeles, California. And while Daniel is a little nervous, hesitant to fit in, he does end up making a few friends, including a local popular cheerleader named Allie Mills, played by Elizabeth Shue, but he also runs afoul of Allie's ex boyfriend, Johnny Lawrence, played by William Zabka, who is one of the top students at the local Cobra Kai dojo, where he practices karate. He is eventually helped out of trouble by the maintenance man in his building, Mr. Miyagi, played by Pat Morita, who ends up entering Daniel into a karate tournament so he can fight the bullies head on and ultimately prove something of himself. Now, this film, I heard so many people's talking about it, and surprisingly, I will admit it is a very good film. Now, while I admit I do prefer some of the more sci-fi 80s classics, like I'd more prefer something like Ghostbusters, Die Hard, Princess Bride, or Robocop. I do see why people consider this one a classic and why they love it. I mean, it is a really good film. Maybe I'm just not that into sports films as a whole, but I do actually think it's really good. And from the techniques that Mr. Miyagi uses in order to teach Daniel, I mean, they might seem bizarre, but honestly, when they actually slowed down and he actually started to show Daniel how he had actually learned karate by washing the car, sanding the floors, painting his fence, and painting his house, I was like, it's weird, but it works. I mean, could anyone use this type of techniques in the real world? Possibly, possibly not. I honestly couldn't say. I never took karate, so I can't say how they do all this. But still, it does seem to work for them, and they do give them some very nice kind of character moments as well. I mean, Daniel, you can definitely tell when moments when he's being cocky, moments when he's trying to be serious, moments when he's feeling down, and moments when he's legitimately trying, which is nice to see. They also give Mr. Miyagi, Pat Morita's character, a very good backstory too, with him supposedly being the way that he is because he lost his wife and unborn child due to complications, which he wasn't there to witness because he was in the military, which is understandable. I do think, from what I've seen of comparisons, I do think I would have preferred the origin story they gave for Jackie Chan's version of the character, but you know what? It's still a very good thing. The only minor complaint I would say about this, and I really do mean minor, is there's a kid towards the beginning of the film called Freddy Fernandez, played by Israel Jarbo. And I'm sorry if I butchered that name, my apologies. But Freddy welcomes Daniel to the apartment block, and he ultimately seems to be the first friend that Daniel's making. And then he just kind of disappears from the film. I mean, I looked it up later on to see what the character was called and find out what happened. And apparently he does show up throughout the film, but I just thought, okay, Daniel's starting to make a friend, and then suddenly this friend is just gone. I mean, apparently he does show up at the final dojo, and he is shown lifting Danny. Maybe I just missed that, but I kind of felt like they could have done a bit more with this character. I mean, you could maybe say that the reason why he's avoiding Daniel throughout the rest of the film is out of a sense of self-preservation, because, well, you got Johnny Lawrence coming down on him. But I do kind of feel like they could have maybe shown a scene of the two of them maybe meeting up, and then Freddy saying, "Look, I'm sorry, man, I can't do this," and maybe he's actually beside Ali and Mr. Miyagi during the final fight scenes. But for what it's worth, while I do prefer the more kind of sci-fi 80s movies, for people who said that this is one of the 80s classics, I'll agree with that. I mean, as I said, I'm not that big on sports movies, but you know what? The Karate Kid from 1984, I definitely think it's worth your time. If you manage to get hold of it, check it out. It's actually a pretty good film. Anyway, that was my quick, short little review on The Karate Kid from 1984. Anyway, until next time, see ya.